For decades, the delicate balance between the United States and Russia has been governed by three critical principles: peaceful coexistence to stave off nuclear annihilation, responsible competition to avoid direct military confrontation, and careful diplomacy to manage flashpoints from Europe to the Arctic. Yet as tensions escalate and global powers shift, a darker reality emerges, one where the US could find itself pushed into the unthinkable: a direct military strike on Russia. A confrontation no one ever imagined or wanted. So what if the time has come? What if the US is ready to seize a rare moment of weakness in Russia's crumbling regime and make a decisive move to not only defeat but conquer a faltering global power? Here's how the unimaginable could unfold day by day. If you expect us to jump straight into day one of the invasion, think again. A conquest of this magnitude can't simply begin with missiles in the air or boots on the ground. A task as monumental as conquering one of the leading global powers, no matter how weakened it may be in the moment, requires meticulous preparation long before day one. Every aspect of the operation, logistics, alliances, intelligence, must be flawlessly coordinated. So that's precisely where we'll start in the video, with the intricate web of planning that precedes any military action. Now, if the US were contemplating an invasion of a country it had little intelligence on, the preparation phase could stretch months or even years, filled with uncertainty and risks. But this is Russia we're talking about. The US has been keeping a watchful eye on the country for years, tracking its military maneuvers, economic fluctuations, and internal strife. This level of scrutiny transforms the timeline dramatically. So instead of a protracted build-up, the groundwork can be laid in a matter of weeks. To define the timeline even further, with the wealth of intelligence at their fingertips, the US military planners can spring into action within roughly 1 month. Though we can't give you a more precise date, one thing's for sure: it won't be during the winter. If there's one thing the US has learned from past conflicts and operations, such as the Russo-Japanese War and Operation Barbarossa, it's that winter warfare in Russia can be nothing but a treacherous endeavor. Russia's brutal cold can sap morale, cripple logistics, and expose even the best-laid plans to catastrophic failure. With this in mind, let's join the US operatives in the command center, presumably sometime in early spring, as they orchestrate the complex operation of invading Russia. Day 30 before the mission. Intelligence is the backbone of any military operation. It can mean the difference between triumph and catastrophic failure on the battlefield. Luckily, the US has never had issues in this department, leveraging its cutting-edge technology and a vast network of human sources to maintain an edge over an adversary, thus ensuring each strategic move is informed by precise, real-time data. This time, it's all about assessing Russian military capabilities and vulnerabilities. It's no secret that the war in Ukraine has left the Russian military battered and beleaguered, a once mighty force now reeling from crushing defeats, logistical failures, and plummeting morale that will haunt it for years. In the first 2.5 years of the war alone, Russia lost almost 650,000 troops, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. The country also lost the following equipment during the same period: nearly 9,000 tanks, over 17,000 armored fighting vehicles, more than 25,000 vehicles and fuel tanks, almost 18,500 artillery systems, roughly 1,200 multiple launch rocket systems, almost 1,000 air defense systems, over 360 airplanes, more than 300 helicopters, nearly 16,000 drones, and almost 30 ships and boats. It's safe to say that the scars of this brutal conflict run deep, leaving the Russian military not just depleted in numbers, but also fundamentally altered in its strategic capabilities. However, with Russia's notorious history of obfuscation and misinformation, discerning the true extent of its devastation remains an elusive challenge. The official reports coming from the Kremlin often paint a rosier picture than reality, masking any losses and failures behind a veil of propaganda. So it's the US intelligence officer's job to peel back this intricate layer of deception and unveil the truth behind the propaganda. It certainly helps that Russia suffers from a fundamental lack of operational security in its military. To this end, the US will deploy intelligence operatives across Eastern Europe, embedding them with allies to gather crucial information. Advanced surveillance drones, such as the Northrop RQ-4 Global Hawk, will also play a pivotal role in this mission. When these jet-powered drones take to the skies, they can travel for a mind-blowing 14,000 miles and boast an impressive mission endurance window of over 34 hours. Throw its cutting-edge optics into the mix, and it becomes clear why these drones might be selected to silently hover over Eastern Europe, stitching together a real-time mosaic of intelligence. As the analysts back at the command center pore over the data, they uncover vulnerabilities in Russian air defenses and troop deployments, pinpointing exactly how many military units are at full readiness. Day 25 before the invasion. It's time to start mobilizing US forces and securing supply chains. The initial phase of conquering Russia would likely require at least 200,000 troops, so that's precisely how many are being activated for this audacious mission. Now, you might think that 200,000 troops is not enough, given that Operation Barbarossa involved over 3.8 million personnel and still failed spectacularly. However, this isn't a straightforward comparison, as the landscape has changed dramatically since those days, and modern warfare is governed by different rules. Plus, the US would never make the same mistake as those who underestimated the resilience of a vast land and a proud people. That's why the US will go all out. The mobilized Marines will be equipped with Bell Boeing V-22 Osprey multi-mission aircraft for rapid deployment, while the Army personnel will be supported by the best in the game, the Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. Of course, air superiority will play a decisive role in this conflict, which can only mean one thing, or two if we're being nitpicky: the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor and the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II. These aircraft are strategically positioned across bases in Eastern Europe to ensure dominance in the skies. Now, we know what some of you might think. As soon as Russia gets a whiff of the US forces mobilizing, the Kremlin will unleash its nuclear arsenal in a desperate bid to remain in control. However, that reaction may not be as immediate as it seems. You see, the Kremlin is acutely aware of the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear strike, not only for the immediate devastation it would cause, but also for the potential total annihilation. That's why Russia will likely refrain from resorting to nuclear options in the early stages of the conflict. That and several other reasons. Number one, the strategic calculus of a nuclear engagement is far more complex than simply pressing a button. Number two, the use of nuclear weapons would instantly escalate the situation beyond any semblance of control, risking a full-scale nuclear war that would decimate Russia itself. And number three, Russia understands that the US has a robust nuclear deterrent ready to respond with overwhelming force. After all, the US and Russia are neck and neck in the nuclear department. Take the 2024 estimates as an example. According to the Federation of American Scientists, out of over 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world at the time, Russia possessed 5,580, while the US boasted 5,428. As for the actively deployed strategic nuclear warheads, both nations were thought to have the same number, around 1,700. So let's take the nuclear arsenal out of the equation for now. Day 20 before the invasion. The psychological operations, or PSYOP for short, gradually begin. These operations will play a more prominent role further down the road, but now they start with a subtle but powerful campaign designed to sow doubt and discord within the Russian ranks. Prior to the war in Ukraine, achieving this goal would be nothing short of a Herculean task, given the fierce loyalty of Russian military forces. But using your own people as nothing but cannon fodder and sending them to die with no training, equipment, or support has a way of eroding that loyalty. No matter how much time passes, the bitterness from what took place in Ukraine will fester in the hearts of the Russian soldiers, breeding a sense of betrayal that can't easily be suppressed. However, for the US to have any chance of successfully conquering Russia, its PSYOPs can't only target the military. They must extend into the civilian realm, reaching the very fabric of Russian society. By planting seeds of doubt among the populace, especially the young people, the US could disrupt the unyielding support for the regime and transform it into a cauldron of dissent. Day 15 before the invasion. An operation of this magnitude can't be carried out in isolation. The US will need to secure alliances with NATO partners, especially those in close proximity to Russia, the Baltic states, Norway, Finland, Poland, and Ukraine. As you can imagine, this won't be particularly challenging, as each of these states has felt the chilling winds of Russian aggression firsthand in one way or another. Japan will probably also be part of these behind-closed-doors conversations due to its strategic interest in countering regional threats and, more importantly for the US, its proximity to Russia in the Pacific. Day 10 before the invasion. A comprehensive attack plan is being crafted as the countdown continues. The final plan will integrate all the gathered intelligence, logistical considerations, and diplomatic agreements. Commanders would evaluate Russian tactics, focusing on their past performances in conflicts like Ukraine and Syria, but also understanding that they will adapt to counter a peer-level adversary. After Russia's abysmal performance in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, calling the country a near-peer competitor to the US might be as misguided as designating a rusty, malfunctioning rifle as combat-ready. Then again, this exact scenario took place in Ukraine time after time, so are you truly surprised that Russia still sees itself as a heavyweight contender? Day 5 before the invasion. In the lead-up to the invasion, the US cyber warfare units intensify their operations against Russian critical infrastructure. Power grids, transporting networks, and communication systems are just some elements that are targeted with a simple goal: creating chaos and confusion. This will hamper the response capabilities within an already weakened Russia, giving the US forces a tactical advantage from the get-go. Speaking of the get-go, the countdown has reached its final hours, and the moment of reckoning has arrived. It's time for the US forces to initiate the attack against Russia. So as dawn breaks on day 1, a carefully orchestrated symphony of military might is unleashed. Day 1. If the US has any chance of conquering Russia, it must go all out straight away. That's why the initial wave of assaults will go straight for the jugular. Russia's air defense system, once believed to be the most robust in the world. To achieve this goal, the US will orchestrate a series of explosions through the western air defense perimeter that's been established to guard against NATO air attacks. Unleashing this hell on Russia will be none other than the B-2 stealth bombers, the ghosts of the sky, renowned for their ability to evade sophisticated long-range tracking radar. These wings of destruction will be followed by B-52 bombers, equipped with standoff attack munitions, releasing volleys of missiles that devastate Russian airfields and obliterate fixed surface-to-air missiles, or SAM sites. This attack is a stark contrast to Russia's prior effort to neutralize Ukraine's air defenses during the war, executed with far less coordination and intensity. Instead, this assault will be a meticulously planned operation, reminiscent of the shock and awe that marked the beginning of Operation Desert Storm during the Gulf War. Why draw a parallel here? It's simple. During the Gulf War, the Iraqi air defenses consisted of SAMs of predominantly Soviet origin. These defenses were also widely considered to be lethal and ferocious, and yet they failed to offer any significant opposition when faced with the overwhelming might of the US military technology and strategy, just as Russian air defenses will do. As the dust from the bombers settles, the F-35s move in to eliminate air bases on the other side of the country, along Russia's eastern borders. These attacks will also aim to disrupt vital rail infrastructure, a lifeline for Russian logistics. Historically, the Russian reliance on rail has left the Russian armed forces vulnerable to sabotage and air attacks. It's also made Russian military operations and force buildups easier to predict and monitor. Of course, the Russian Air Force won't sit idly by, as the US Air Force wreaks havoc on the country's eastern flank. The Russian interceptors will rise to meet the F-35s, which play a crucial role in maintaining the momentum of the US attack. However, the moment they do, they will be met with the unmatched power of F-22 Raptors, the apex predators of the skies, which will swat Russian fighters from the heavens with deadly precision. Day 1 won't just end in the skies. The US will also likely launch a ground assault, targeting the Kaliningrad exclave, a move steeped in strategic significance. How so? Well, Kaliningrad is uniquely positioned between NATO countries, serving as a vital military outpost for Russia and hosting advanced missile systems that can threaten European targets. By targeting this enclave, the US aims to disrupt Russian military operations and weaken its ability to project power in northern Europe. Additionally, Kaliningrad functions as a crucial logistical hub for Russian forces, and neutralizing it would complicate their resupply efforts and troop movements. Given how important this westernmost region is to Russia, it shouldn't be surprising that it won't fall easily. The 5,830 square mile enclave will likely become a fiercely contested battlefield, and its heavy fortification certainly won't do the US troops any favors. Up until 2016, Kaliningrad's military forces were relatively weak. However, by 2021, they had undergone a massive transformation. The once underpowered region now bristles with modern weaponry and well-equipped forces. The 11th Army Corps, with a ground force of 12,000 to 18,000 troops in 2021, bolstered by T-72 tanks, mobile rocket launchers and artillery, forms a key part of Kaliningrad's defense. Adding to this formidable presence, the 336th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, a heavily mechanized unit capable of launching air assaults, and air power consisting of Su-30SM, Su-24, and Su-27 aircraft, and protected by a robust S-400 missile defense system. That's why the American ground forces will rumble into action with overwhelming air support. Abrams tanks and AH-64 Apache helicopters will spearhead this assault, raining hell on the Russian defensive lines in Kaliningrad. The battles will be brutal yet swift. The T-72 tanks housed in Kaliningrad will be no match for the American Abrams. Operation Desert Storm has already proven this. Even the early M1 Abrams model outclassed all the Cold War-era Soviet tanks used in the conflict, even though the latter were believed to be formidable adversaries at the time. So by the time day 1 of the invasion ends, Russian ground forces will have faced arguably the most significant defeat since the initial onslaught of Operation Barbarossa. This day will also set the stage for days to come and send a powerful message: the US military isn't playing around. Day 5. By day 5, the US military gains key footholds in Kaliningrad, now holding roughly 60% of the territory. This impressive achievement is made possible by the momentum of the initial shock and awe strikes, which carried the US forces deep into the Russian territory. Still, the war is far from over. Russia has historically demonstrated a remarkable ability to absorb heavy losses and regroup in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Pair this ability with Russia's sheer territorial depth, and you'll understand why there are fears that the country is preparing for a grinding war of attrition. Of course, it's rather difficult to regroup when you're getting hammered by constant air and missile strikes, so the US is also not showing any signs of slowing down. Sure, there are some fears of overextension, but American commanders have prepared for such risks. The combination of rapid territorial gains and relentless pressure on Russian infrastructure is intended to keep Moscow from stabilizing long enough to mount a coordinated counteroffensive. Day 7, Kaliningrad has fallen. The battle that started as a ferocious clash has come to a close, leaving the Russian stronghold under US control. The trauma from fighting in Ukraine was the decisive factor here, as the Russian troops were in no shape to endure the full might of the US military, neither physically nor psychologically. Bombarded from above, getting harassed on all sides, and knowing that reinforcements would never come, the already weakened morale of the Russian troops crumbled entirely. So as the US has demonstrated in 7 days, Kaliningrad is no longer an impregnable fortress. It might have been one years ago, but now Russia's military might has come crashing down for the entire world to see. Just because the US managed to secure a victory in Kaliningrad doesn't mean this came without significant costs. After all, Russia is still an artillery powerhouse, and the terrain of Kaliningrad, characterized by its urban centers and fortified positions, provide ample opportunities for Russian forces to demonstrate this. So conquering this vital region came at a price, both in terms of resources and human life, the latter being comparable to the losses suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan. For comparison's sake, 143 US troops were killed in action in the Gulf War, 96 of whom were Army personnel, 20 Air Force members, and 27 Marine Corps and Navy soldiers combined. The total in-theater death count for the US troops ended up being 382, while the total non-theater death count reached 1,565. Day 14. 2 weeks in, and Kaliningrad is firmly under US control. However, this doesn't mean that the situation is stable. Small unit skirmishes and ambushes persist, reflecting the ongoing threat posed by remnants of the Russian military accustomed to employing guerrilla warfare tactics in the urban landscape. However, the US has no time to waste, so the US troops are already heading toward the Russian border with Latvia. A Baltic defense line along this border has been in construction ever since the war in Ukraine, and the urgency to reinforce it has intensified following the fall of Kaliningrad. US military planners recognize that securing this border is crucial for NATO's strategic posture in Eastern Europe, as well as the continuation of the US attack on Russia. However, there's a small snag in the plan to reach the Baltic borders. The Belarusian government, closely allied with Moscow, has been increasingly hostile to US military movements in the region. Intelligence reports indicate that Belarusian troops are mobilizing near the border, raising concerns that they may attempt to obstruct US forces or at least provide logistical support to Russian military remnants. However, this isn't a surprise to the US strategists. That's why the US has been mobilizing the Belarusian resistance forces inside Poland for weeks, training and equipping them to liberate their nation. This effectively takes Belarus out of the equation, as instead of providing help to Russia, it can now only ask for assistance from Moscow while its own resistance movement gains momentum. Day 21. With Belarus taken care of, the US forces are free to expand their line of operation into Russia, specifically targeting the regions of Kursk and Belgorod. If Kursk sounds familiar to you, that's because Ukraine launched a cross-border incursion into this region in August 2024, taking out scores of Russian military with artillery and drone strikes in the process. If a country as resource-constrained as Ukraine could achieve this level of success, it stands to reason that a well-equipped and strategically coordinated US operation could not only replicate but exceed those efforts. And it does. With the US starting to occupy more and more of its territory, the Kremlin is now in a state of full-blown panic. Or at the very least, it's now unmistakably displaying the signs of desperation. This urgency has prompted a national mobilization effort as Russian leaders scramble to bolster their military presence and shore up defenses against the advancing US forces. However, the mobilization effort is met with mixed success. Why? Because there's barely enough experienced personnel left to effectively reinforce the ranks. Most of the professional soldiers have been lost in the brutal fighting in Ukraine, and those who remain are often disillusioned and hesitant to re-engage due to a growing anti-war sentiment. Thank you, PSYOP. However, we also know that the Kremlin has no issues mobilizing citizens by force. Old people, disabled people, gravely injured veterans, convicts, all of them have been coerced into service during the Russo-Ukrainian War, and the situation is no different today. Naturally, this haphazard approach leads to a poorly trained and unmotivated force, further complicating the Kremlin's efforts to mount a cohesive defense against the US advance. This leaves enough room for the US to consolidate its gains and losses. Day 30. A month into the conflict, the US forces have endured significant losses, with thousands of casualties reported, at least half of whom are fatalities. The US military has also lost quite a lot of hardware, which won't be easily replaced given the country's inability to replenish combat losses en masse. However, these losses weren't for nothing. By day 30, the US has pushed the Russian forces back significantly, claiming territories and gaining strategic footholds. This advance has disrupted Russian supply lines and communications networks, creating a ripple effect of disorganization within their ranks. At the same time, it's allowed the US forces to establish critical bases for further operations, improving their logistics. With the Russian western flank increasingly exposed, the US forces are preparing to launch targeted operations aimed at further destabilizing the Russian defense. However, they are also turning their attention to the eastern flank once again, seeking to obliterate the Russian Pacific Fleet. This move has more to do with ensuring maritime superiority in the region than merely addressing immediate threats. However, the Russian Far East is of no great importance to the US at the moment, so the majority of US military resources remain focused on the European theater. Why? Because it will soon be time to go for the ultimate target, Moscow itself. The strategic calculations of the US military planners hinge on the belief that destabilizing the heart of the Russian regime will be the decisive blow needed to bring about a swift resolution to the conflict. If Moscow falls, the entirety of Russia will follow suit. But unfortunately for the US, Russia is also well aware of this fact. Remember when we mentioned leaving nuclear weapons out of the equation? Well, it's time to bring them right back, because in this high-stakes moment, the ultimate deterrent is now front and center. The grim reality is that the Kremlin would rather risk total annihilation than lose grip on its power and witness Moscow fall. So in the worst-case scenario, the US troops won't even have the chance to come close to Russia's capital before the order is given to unleash hellfire, turning the conflict into a catastrophe that will reshape the world as we know it. Back in 2019, Princeton's Science and Global Security program published a simulation demonstrating how even a limited tactical nuclear exchange in Europe could escalate to a full-scale global nuclear conflict. According to the simulation, as many as 91.5 million people would die within hours and many more in the months and years to come, a worst-case scenario indeed. In the best-case scenario, the US will have some 10 to 15 days to decisively weaken Russian defenses and secure key strategic positions, allowing for a potential diplomatic resolution before tensions escalate beyond control. During this period, the US would likely target another critical city, St. Petersburg. Russia's second-largest city has been under blockade since the onset of the conflict, with the US Navy conducting targeted strikes on Russian military assets within the city on an almost daily basis. This continuous effort would potentially allow the US to capture the city, but the many challenges of urban combat would undoubtedly make this task a beast. And remember, every passing moment in this conflict is now a gamble, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Day 45. With the specter of nuclear escalation looming, US military planners face an impossible choice. Continuing the assault could provoke a catastrophic response, but retreating would signal a significant loss of momentum and embolden Russian forces. In a tense standoff, back-channel negotiations unfold. Ultimately, facing overwhelming international pressure and the very real threat of mutual destruction, the US leaders opt for a diplomatic solution. The conflict reaches a tense ceasefire, and the situation is de-escalated as much as possible, with both sides reluctantly agreeing to terms. The war ends not with a decisive victory, but with a precarious balance of power, leaving the future uncertain and fraught with tension. The lesson is clear. There's no conquering Russia, even in a weak state, as long as the country remains one of the two leading nuclear powerhouses in the world. Well, at least not without dealing a severe blow to the other nuclear powerhouse, the US, in the process. But what do you think? Do you believe there is a way for the US to conquer a weakened Russia without triggering a catastrophic escalation? If so, share your scenario in the comments section below.